In the buildings behind me, the British government is busy trying to work out what Brexit actually means for the UK. In early October 2016, Theresa May gave us the first firm indications of how she intends to take the UK out of the EU. In this first part, we'll explain what we think this means. In part 2, we'll focus on some potential areas of opportunity and change for the media industry. And in part 3, we'll consider whether, for media, Brexit will always mean Brexit, and whether that's a good or a bad thing. The UK government will trigger exit negotiations by the end of March 2017. This fires the starting gun on up to 2 years of negotiations. The UK will probably have left the EU by the end of spring 2019. In negotiations, the government has said that its top priority is regaining control over immigration, even if this comes at the cost of access to the single market. We also know that the government doesn't think that any of the current models, such as the EEA framework, are right for the UK. This means stability of a sort, but what are the consequences and questions raised by this approach? The first big unknown is what a new trade deal will look like. This will have to dovetail the Omnibus Act, if indeed it is agreed by then. Secondly, there are some tricky timing issues around new EU laws coming in. For example, the portability rules under the digital single market. Third, there is the reciprocity problem. New trade deal or no new trade deal, once we've actually left the EU, we should largely be in control of our own destiny domestically. But when it comes to arrangements which depend on cooperation with EU countries, it gets a bit more complicated. In the absence of an actual plan, it's worth considering where the holes could be for the media industry.
So for a while now, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, or the AVMS, and before that the TVWF, the Television Without Frontiers Directive, have been the cornerstones of audiovisual media services regulation in the EU. And they've enshrined a very simple principle, which is that a broadcaster needs one license from one regulator in order to be able to broadcast across the single market. Of course, if the UK leaves the EU, it will no longer have access to the AVMS regulatory framework. So this would be a really major change. I mean, it would involve effectively going back to broadcasting regulation before the AVMS, before the TVWF, and back to 1989. The bottom line is the UK can't just unilaterally decide that it wants to continue operating on the basis of the AVMS. It can only do that if it can negotiate it as part of any new trade deal. And there's just no guarantee that this kind of thing is going to be at the top of the government's list of priorities when negotiating that deal.
Theresa May has told us 2 things. 1, curbing immigration is a top priority, and 2, a new trade deal is unlikely to emulate any existing deals. This means that the immediate practical challenge for the media industry is twofold. 1, to avoid becoming an easy concession in upcoming negotiations, especially when other major industries will be pushing hard for the outcome that they want. And 2, to tell the government what an ideal trade deal would be for media.
The UK will probably want to conclude a new free trade agreement with the EU after the 2 years notice of withdrawal, but it's very unlikely it will have such agreement within the 2-year period. And it also seems unlikely that the UK will become a member of the EEA. So therefore, the only rules binding the UK and the EU for trade purposes will be the WTO rules. And this will be a wholly different situation to the single market rules that we've known up until now. The WTO rules involve most favoured nation treatment and non-discrimination for goods and services on the market. So, as I say, it will be a completely different situation.
So there you have it, the challenge ahead for UK businesses. How do we exit the EU on terms that suit both us and our European partners, without being excluded from important markets, or having access without the power to influence future laws? Take a look at part 2 and part 3 for more Brexit discussion.